Hey everybody, welcome to the Entrepreneur Motivation Podcast. I am your host, Chris Bello, and today I've got Annemarie Cross with me. Annemarie, right? That's just how I pronounce it?
Yep, Anne-Marie.
Okay,
Thanks, Chris.
Annemarie. I was like, it couldn't be Anne-Mary, it's Annemarie.
It
So great
is.
to have you, Annemarie. I appreciate your time and for you jumping on over there. It's 8 a.m. at the time of this recording in the
It
future
is. In the
on a
future,
Wednesday.
don't tell anyone this, Chris, but it's going to be an awesome day for you tomorrow.
Thank you. That's so cool. It's like I'm talking to a time traveler.
Yeah.
But a quick intro, Annemarie Cross is a personal branding and podcast strategist, the CEO and founder of Ambitious Entrepreneur Podcast Network, Industry Thought Leader Academy, and author of Industry Thought Leader, How to Go from Invisible to Influential and Profitable with a Podcast. Dubbed the podcasting queen, Annemarie is recognized as a pioneer in this space, having started her first podcast in 2008. She now teaches service-based businesses how to build and scale their businesses online with a robust podcast strategy. Wow, so 2008, you were one of the original podcasters. I hear some
Yeah.
people like Pat Flynn started back in around the same time. So you've been in
Yeah.
it for a long time now.
Well, I was in the career industry, and it was probably around 2005 I started using audio, and I had one of these little digital things that I'd keep in my pocket devices, and I would record colleagues at networking events, and then I'd use that as part of just content that I was sharing with my clients and obviously with my community, my newsletter. And then we had those platforms that were called tele seminar platforms. I don't know if you recall those. The audio was horrendous, but we were using those to connect. And then in 2008, that was when the global financial crisis hit, and the colleague and I were just so annoyed at mainstream media, television, print, radio, for the doom and gloom that they kept portraying. Yeah, job losses were, around the world. It was tough. But we knew that if people continued to listen to the doom and gloom, they would remain stuck. We needed to change our approach to job search, or they did. And when you get in front of an opportunity to showcase why you should be the best candidate, if you've got doom and gloom that's really driving your mindset, we knew that was going to impact you negatively. So we had no idea what we were doing, but we said, we need to be the voice of hope and inspiration. Yes. We didn't even know the word podcast then. Let's start an online radio show. Yes. So we did, and oh boy, it was so much fun, a huge learning curve. But we did that for 2 years, used Blog Talk Radio, which when we go back and listen to the audio, horrendous. But anyway, was able to meet incredible colleagues and guests from around the world, impact so many people. As I said, we did that for 2 years. We kind of went our separate ways. My co-host started, getting into more online digital space, because back then that was when a lot of the new platforms like Twitter and Facebook was really coming on its own. And I've continued to podcast ever since. So it's kind of gone full circle for me now. Now I'm teaching it and helping others.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I've heard recently, I know that podcasting is kind of like what books were before. A lot of people have self-published books now, and so so many people have books that they publish through Amazon. And now I'm starting to hear more and more friends and colleagues and competitors are starting podcasts as well. And of course, I'm always curious to see, okay, who's going to actually last, right? Because there's that valley of death around episode 10 to 20, where people just, it's so much work. I don't have the time for it. You don't see the results for quite some time in most cases, I would say, unless you've got some publicity or something behind your launch. It's usually a slow build. And I'm sure you found that.
It is usually a slow build, and it was interesting because one of the reasons why we separated, the fact that obviously my co-host really wanted to focus more on other areas, as did I. I found that then, 2 years on, many of my clients were thinking, why should I make money for other businesses? I've got expertise. I can become a consultant, start my own business. And then they were coming to me and saying, well, hang on, Annemarie, we don't need resumes anymore. We don't need online, LinkedIn bios and things like that. We need help with our marketing. However, one of the things that I found was that during those 2 years, we struggled to monetize our podcast. We could not find any mentors, because really what we only had to compare our podcast to was the radio space.
Right.
And people were telling us, well, to make money from your podcast, you have to get advertising and sponsors. But of course, back then, the radio was such a strong platform. They're even struggling now. I've even had radio hosts come to me kind of secretly and saying, how are you monetizing your podcast? And when I tell them, well, look, you need to monetize, because a lot of my clients, most of them are service-based businesses. You've got a level of expertise. So to monetize your podcast is through monetizing your program. So you seed and lead. There's whole strategies that we teach around that. And so we struggled because we only had a smaller but niche audience. But now we find that even with a smaller niche audience, you can make incredible income from that when you've got the right seed and lead strategies in place and if you've got an integrated approach. And it was Women in Leadership podcast that I started after my worst business failure ever. Couldn't create content, couldn't write, couldn't create programs, but I could ask the good questions. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go and interview other women in business, other women in leadership, and I'm going to learn from them as I'm dealing with kind of that grief and loss. And 3 episodes in to that podcast, I had 2 clients or people that found me, Googled me, had no idea who I was, and pretty much rang me and said, we want to work with you. So there was 2 4-figure clients. And it wasn't until a number of years later I thought, man, if I could do that accidentally, imagine what could happen if I backtracked, looked at the steps, what was needed, what was required, what was out there that enabled them to kind of go from have no idea who Annemarie is to I want to work with her. And that's kind of where I've spent a number of years kind of mapping that out, putting it into systems so that I can now teach that. And so you can create a really nice funnel for yourself, you know, nurturing listeners into leads, inquiries, and ultimately paying customers from your very first episode.
Absolutely. And I think I've heard of, I forget who the author of the blog was, but you've probably heard of the 1,000 True Fans. Have you heard of that blog post?
I have.
Where basically it's saying that all you need is 1,000 true fans, whether you're a musician or an artist or a podcaster. 1,000 true fans will go much further for you than 10,000 so-so fans. I don't know what the numbers again, but the idea behind it is you don't need as many followers as you think to be successful, generate an income. And I love what you said there about the right funnel. You know, if you have the right systems in place and you get the right audience and the right message, they'll find you. And I love how you stumbled upon it. We're 3 episodes in, you got 2 paying clients. That's awesome.
I know. I thought, man, I'd love to make more accidents like that. But I love what you said about, you know, kind of the fans versus followers. And that's actually one of my podcasting principles. Create fans and rather than followers. And how many podcasters or potential podcasters, businesses who want to leverage a podcast, we often hear them say, well, what technology do I need? Right. And I always say message before make a model of the microphone, because you can't edit and mix compelling content that converts from fluff and banter. You just can't. You know, you could have 1 million downloads. And I've actually heard colleagues who had started podcasts years ago, all of a sudden had this audience of people that just loved them and then had to shut it down because it was taking up so much time and energy and they weren't generating the revenue on the back of that to be able to justify that. And so that's so important to really, to make sure you've got all of the right steps in place so that you don't have to walk away from something that you've put a lot of heart and soul and energy into because you're just not generating results.
Absolutely. And I heard it on another podcast recently. It was probably Pat Flynn. I like listening to Smart Passive Income quite a bit. I was listening to some of his original first episodes just to see how bad they were, because it always motivates me to see how far people have come. And they weren't too bad, but I mean, they're noticeably worse quality than his newer stuff. But he was mentioning in one of the podcasts that you need to have the right intention. And obviously you want to monetize it, but if you're starting it with the intent to monetize it, you just won't be successful because your mind's not in the right place. For example, I had someone who recently reached out to me and he was proposing I could be a co-host on a new podcast he's starting. And first of all, it's like anyone who's trying to pitch a business venture, you know that they're probably overly ambitious, they're overly excited. 3-4 months in, how serious are they really going to be? How interested will they be? But he told me on the call, I gave him 15 or 20 minutes just to pitch me on his idea. And he's like, yeah, man, I just want to see how fast I can monetize. And so I just knew he just had the wrong intention because I came from the angle of, I'm just going to create content and post weekly without figuring out how to monetize it. Let me find my voice first, and then, I'll figure out the monetization piece later. And over time, I've started to develop the systems and automate and get the virtual assistants to help with the editing and offload a lot of the work from my plate. And it's starting to kind of sort itself out, right? I'm in real estate, so I'm getting referrals and people that I've interviewed in my market. A year later, they buy a house with me, and it's just really coming full circle without me even really promoting it or anything. It's just I tell people what I do, I add value, I give them a platform, and it comes back full circle, which is pretty awesome to see.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that because, and definitely you have to start with, I always say you have to start with the end in mind. You have to have that clear intention, as Pat would have said. But the way that I approach it is, as I mentioned, I work with a lot of service-based businesses. So they've already got they've already got rungs on the board, so to speak. They've already got often, maybe even decades of experience. So they're not really carving out their niche. They kind of already know who their niche is. So where the end in mind is really, where do you want to? There's a number of different things. What message are you really wanting to cut through that noise? And there's a term called, I didn't coin this, I learned this from one of my mentors, the tip of the spear. And I think now as businesses, because so many more people are online due to what's happening in the world, a lot of businesses now are being forced, and all of a sudden they've realised, hang on a minute, there's some awesome stuff going online, which means a lot more noise. So businesses, no matter whether you're a service-based business or a product-based business, you have to revisit your message and ask yourself, are we cutting through the noise, or are we just saying the same old that everyone else is doing? So if someone's been in the industry as a service-based business for some time, there are obviously, IP, intellectual property, there are systems that you've identified, things that you've accidentally stumbled across that you've been able to systematize and now be able to share and teach and save someone hours, if not months or even years, of headache and money that you can then share. And so with the end in mind, I say to people, you've really got to get clear on your message, who your ideal customer is, and where you are monetizing as far as the programs and offerings that you are going to be offering. Because if you think of a seed and lead strategy, you want to make sure that what you're providing, even the guests that are coming onto your show, also add value to that ideal, customer. Because, I mentioned to you earlier around where you can have an audience of millions of downloads, but you still can't monetize it. I've done some observing over the last kind of, number of decades, and I've created what I call my podcasting positioning quadrant. And there's 4 quadrants. If I can explain it so you can picture it, but if you imagine that with the 4 quadrants, there's an arrow going up on the left-hand side and an arrow going across the bottom. And the arrow that's going up is for audience, and the arrow going along the bottom is for authority. So when you think that someone has got and by the way, all of these quadrants are fine because it depends on where you want your podcast to be. So the very bottom left is where you would have an entertainer. So they don't necessarily have a high level of authority in any particular topic or subject. They're not an expert in their field, therefore they wouldn't really be seen as authority. And that's okay. They're entertaining. But they also don't have a high level of audience engagement either. So then if you go to the top of the top left of the quadrant, that's where you might have a celebrity or an influencer. Now, they may not necessarily be seen as an authority or an expert, but they've got an engaged community because they just love that person. You often get the influencers, the celebrities. That's where I would have said my colleagues who had to shut down their podcast, they would have been seen as that celebrity, kind of that. They loved the content that they were sharing every week, but they didn't have that authority. They didn't monetize it, couldn't monetize it. Then on the bottom right-hand quadrant is where you would have an expert. So you've got high level of authority, but not necessarily high level of engaged community and audience. And this is where I say that people come for the topic and then they go off again. But if you position yourself at the top right-hand quadrant, which is a trusted authority, not only do you have a high level of authority, but you've got a highly engaged audience. because they not only come for the topic, they start listening to you. And you've got this kind of charisma that you intentionally bring to the show every single time, because you might be speaking about a similar topic that thousands of other podcast hosts do. But it's in your experience, it's in the storytelling, it's in the way that you engage, and just how you show up that really resonates with that audience member. And when you do that consistently and intentionally, you become that trusted authority. And that's why people come for the topic, but they return for the host. And then they'll listen to a couple of shows and they go, I really like this guy, Chris. I'm going to subscribe to his podcast. And then Chris has got this beautiful seed and lead strategy in place to say, hey, by the way, I know that you are a motivated entrepreneur, and so am I. And there were some things that I did that completely changed the way that I did business. And I want to share those with you so that you don't have to go through the same mistakes. If you sign up for my 3-part podcast series, by the way, I've got a quiz there that will help you focus on exactly what is not working in your business. You can access it there, my gift to you. And then those people who are your ideal clients who are going, man, I like the sound of that. Where are they going? They're off.
They're following that link.
Now, those 3 podcasts that I talked about are the very first 3 podcasts you create in your podcast strategy, because they become this resource that you will invite people to access at the end of every podcast episode that you do. And the reason that I had found that out was because one of my clients, who's actually in one of my workshops, I said to her, your thought leadership really begins at that 4th Street episode, but even episode 0. And that's where you show people what they're going to expect. And if you really create a community that has, a similar challenge and a similar cause, like you're creating this culture, this community that just loves hanging out together. So that's when you can really create, an incredible podcast that you can then monetize. You're always leading with value, but you're also for that smaller percentage of audience who are ready to make that decision right now. You need to give them what's that next step. Otherwise, they'll be off somewhere else looking, and don't even realize that you're offering that. But then those people who continue to kind of listen and subscribe to your podcast, when they're ready, because you're top of mind and they're subscribed, they will, they'll kind of follow that lead. But that's kind of the strategy that I've used, that 3-part, that accidental 3-part series that they had with women in leadership. That's the way that we've kind of systematized that, and that's what we create for every single client, or recommend that they do before they even start their podcast. And that's the call to action.
Yeah, that's great. And I didn't even realize that a lot of people do that. They'll go back and listen to the first episode because it usually is the introductory episode.
Yes. And they binge. They will binge listen. Yeah.
Exactly.
And this is something that I want to provide some feedback. That client that I was talking about at a workshop, she said, you know what? That is actually true. She said, I've been listening to this podcast and I love what the host has to say, and I want to know a little bit more about it, but nowhere has she ever shared who she is, what she does, how I can work with her. All she's done from episode 1 is just interview other people, and what a missed opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. Because there are people who want to pay you. I mean, I've shared this on previous episodes where I had 1 or 2 people reach out. One attorney who listens to my podcast, he reached out and he was wanting to start a podcast, and I wasn't even promoting it or anything. And he's like, hey, I know your time's valuable. Let me know if this is a distraction for you, but I would be interested in paying you to kind of teach me, a couple of different sessions on how to start a podcast, how to get my thoughts together. And we met a few times. He sent me some payment. He prepaid me, which was really cool, because usually, how the service works, like you do the service, then you get paid. It was very neat to see the payment come through first, and he had his bank account of sessions filled. And then after the first session, he actually replenished the account because he found so much value that he wanted to go ahead and book more sessions. And of course, I was still trying to figure out, is this how I monetize it? Is this the right thing that I want to teach? And so I'm not offering that to everyone, but I just wanted to, I said yes to it just to open myself up to the experience of starting to coach someone one-on-one in the audience. And it was a really cool experience that just emerged from me saying, I'm always inviting the audience, connect with me on social media, send me a message. Let me know what you want me to cover on future episodes. And people do it. It's really cool to see. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I need to stop doing it. It's too many. But at the same time, it's people love to get that connection because they're getting access to you, the expert, who usually, like on a radio, you don't get to call the radio show and talk to the host.
No.
The podcast.
Remember your podcast is a platform in which you're really building that thought leadership. So, if you were to say, like, what do you want to become known as? Like you said, you're in real estate, so in other words, if someone were to ask for someone, do you know someone in real estate who specializes in X, Y, and Z? Is your name instantly mentioned, and where I also have found, because I've made all of the mistakes and then some. So all of the principles that I teach because I've done it, and to avoid. And one of the things that I learned, a huge lesson, and I actually closed down my award-winning podcast, one that is often mentioned still. Even though it's been shut down, we stopped production for a number of years. And I was actually asked by several people, would you sell it? And I said, no, because I don't, I may restart it. But it was called Ambitious Entrepreneur Show. But my message got lost in the noise of my own podcast. Ambitious Entrepreneur Show had incredible guests. It was a valuable show. And I learned a lot from my guests, but it wasn't niched enough. My message got lost. And so, when you're thinking about creating your podcast strategy, one of the things that you can do is become a leader in your field. So I say to people, the guests that you have on your podcast should also be stakeholders and influencers in your industry, because you want your podcast to be the go-to of your industry. Right. And those particular guests could also be referral partners, alliance partners, joint venture partners. And I missed all of these opportunities. So I'm very strategic now in, who comes on my show. I mean, obviously it has to, of course, drive value for your audience. But when you do that, then that's when you really, kind of that reputation can really accelerate and become known in your industry.
Absolutely. No, I see the value of that, because if you take the time to have clarity, like you said, and you know what your message is about and who your audience is, those are all things. And I've admitted to the audience, I was like, well, I didn't really know. So I just started. And of course, sometimes it is a little bit generic where it's like entrepreneur motivation, I have some motivation, I have some mindset. It's more like almost like a therapy session for myself, where I get to just speak about what I'm thinking and documenting the journey. And so while I still haven't quite found my own message, it's connected me with some very cool people, highly influential people, people that after the call, we'll talk for 10 minutes and they send me their personal cell phone number, where I'm like, wow, this is really neat. Maybe at the next conference that we're at, we're going to meet and I'm going to tap into their network. And even just like I mentioned.
I'm curious. I'm going to put my question, my host.
Yeah, I need to get some clarity.
So real estate, tell me a little bit more about the real estate that you do.
Right. So I'm based in Houston, Texas, and I started off working in investment real estate. So I'm familiar with off-market properties, evaluating the numbers on, does this make sense as an investment? But I've kind of gravitated more towards the retail stuff. So I am a real estate agent, or realtor, as they call it. And I don't like to position myself as that, just because so many people know, as a title, realtor or real estate agent, everyone knows that. So I always call myself a Houston real estate expert, because I know more than just helping you buy or sell a house. I know about investments and ROI and finding the right connections. So
I mean, that in itself is such a wealth of knowledge. And I mean, now when you think of what's going on in the world, there are challenges, but with challenges there also comes incredible opportunities. Now imagine if you shared the things that you've learned. I'm sure there's principles and systems that you've learned as well. Now, I'm sure that if you have a look at the different audiences, I mean, you've probably got people who want to buy and you've got people who want to sell.
Yep.
You've got people who are also invested in the industry because they're also stakeholders. Now imagine if you created an environment where you got these people, you had success stories from real estate people who, you know, the real wacky conversations with unexpected things. You pull it apart, you know, from your expertise status to say, you know, what worked, what didn't work, what were the insights? Because as a thought leader, as a, you know, trusted authority, what I love about what I'm hearing about your story is you've got the experience, but you've also been able to share within the real estate market investment. You bring a different angle. So, you know, often foresight, you know, what's going to happen, we can only ever provide, when we say quality foresight, I mean, some things are guesstimations, aren't they? But often foresight, when you base it on hindsight, you know, the insights that based on hindsight will give you foresight. So if you use that knowledge, you can kind of share things within the marketplace. And it's kind of like, you need to go and listen to Chris Bello's show because he really knows what's going on. And then what you do with the titles of your podcast episodes, if that kind of focuses and captures some of the keywords that you know people are going to be searching for to do with investment, real estate, that kind of thing, guess who's going to be the person whose content comes up? And that's the kind of thing. Create that resource, you know, some of the more educational type stuff in that 3-part podcast series, and you've got probably checklists. Like I'd imagine you could do a quiz for someone, you know, what's your risk archetype? Because some people's risks are really low. Well, then this is what you need to consider when you're investing. If you've got more of a higher risk of investment and you've got longer time, you could look at investing in this. So you could help them kind of identify that. I mean, obviously haven't really dived too deep into to that, but those are some things that you could really have some fun with. Absolutely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I noticed that I study a lot of other podcasts because I sometimes scroll through all the ones that I'm subscribed to, and there will be some on marketing, some on mindset, some very generic ones where they cover a lot of different topics. And I like to listen. And I actually surveyed the audience too to see, hey, what would you listen to from me? Do you want long episodes, short episodes, interviews? And then I did have the passionate few that just said everything. Like, I'll listen to anything you release, which is kind of cool to see. But of course, a lot of those podcasts are specifically investing in real estate for passive income, you know, buying certain types of properties. And of course, the partners they bring on, everybody basically listening to that is going to eventually be a customer or a potential lead for them. Because say you want to invest in real estate outside of your state passively, and that's what their service is that they provide. So they teach you everything, and their offer is something that would make sense as the next step. So I actually have it on my to-do list. And again, I haven't made it a huge point to monetize, but I do want to at least get real estate referrals and stuff like that. So I can tell my audience, if you know anyone looking to buy or sell in any state in the US, I can help you connect you with the real estate agent. And that would allow me to get real estate referral commissions. So if I'm getting 3-4 deals closing a month, that could be, you know, $10,000+ in just referral commissions coming in that I'm not really taking advantage of. So I know it's on me. I need to, okay, Chris, sit down and actually time block it because there's money there that I'm not tapping into. And people want to support me, right? They like me. They like my message.
Absolutely.
So they want to help me however they can.
They can, And you know what? There may be a way that you can bridge what you're doing now with your current podcast with the new one. And that may be because you may want to target businesses who are, you know, or entrepreneurs who also have an interest in investing.
Exactly.
Because as we know now, and this is where we look at what's happening in the marketplace that you can hang your shingle on or that you really can provide context. Now, as we know as businesses, and it's a huge lesson that many entrepreneurs have learned, if you put all your eggs in one basket, if you've got a supply chain that is wholly and solely based in a certain country and then all of a sudden that country shuts down, your supply chains, you need to diversify. Right. So as part of your entrepreneurial journey, maybe one of the things that you're doing when you get a bit of profit, you start investing in real estate, because you know that, there's more stability in that. And that's, so one of the things that you might do is, have a podcast, and it depends on what you, what bandwidth you have. But if you know that it's going to generate income for you down the track, you might release 2 podcast episodes a week. One that focuses on storytelling, for entrepreneurs, which has a little bit of an edge for the real estate, but then one specifically in the real estate. And so people can then choose to listen. But I tell you what, they'll probably end up listening to both. But anyway, just some ideas. But I'm sure there's a bridge. I'm sure there's a crossover, that you don't, waste all of the audience and community that you've been building. And sometimes go back to to your audience and ask them, and you'll find. But it has to be the feedback that I'll often monitor and really enable to drive my decision making. Are these people my ideal clients, and are they investing? Because some people will give you feedback. They go, yes, do 1 hour podcast, but they'll never be a client.
Right.
And then it's like, well, I love your feedback. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. But I have to go by the way of my ideal clients who actually will invest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something that we all see in our different industries, because even with different buyer clients, for example, I get people who tell me, Chris, I want to buy a house, I want to sell a house. And I heard something funny, that not all leads are prospects, some are suspects, right? They're kind of interested, but they're not very committed. And of course, you start to do the process, you have the consultation call, you send them a couple of houses, and then they're not really interested, not really looking at houses. They're not really wanting to pull the trigger. Their lease doesn't expire. You hear all these different objections, and you realize that maybe a certain client is not going to be pulling the trigger anytime soon. And you've got to focus your effort on the people who are ready and willing to do something in the next 30 or 60 days, because I don't want to burn bridges, but at the same time, I've got to focus on, like you said, the people who are more my ideal client, that know what they want, they're ready to go, and they're not going to be wishy-washy on the fence, right? So I'm learning a lot from our conversation.
One of the things that I also recommend that people do too, and again, this is the strategy, the intention for your podcast, is you've got to also understand your customer journey.
Right.
Because there are some people that, when you look at the customer journey, I kind of, segmented into 3 simple steps, the power of 3: the awareness building, the consideration stage, and then, of course, the decision stage. So you may find that, you've got a podcast episode, because you might decide, well, I'm going to focus my podcast on really nurturing people who are going through the consideration stage to get them, those who are ready, from consideration to decision. And so you're going to provide different pieces of content within that, because they're in the consideration stage, than you would if someone had absolutely no idea about you and hadn't really even started to consider, I'm going to consider doing business with Chris. And so, you may have a podcast then that, if you're thinking, well, I'm going to use it across all of those different, 3 categories, what you could do is, for those people who are almost ready, and they are just needing a couple of, different pieces of information for them to go, yep, this is it. You can have different segments in your podcast where you might go, this is for people who are ready and you want the information because you need it to make a decision. So something short and sweet. And then you go, well, then we're going to go on and we're going to provide a little bit more information to nurture those people. So again, you can look at the structure of your podcast episode and see, can I have different segments that's going to capture and give information in the right way and in the right format and the right time, length of time, that's going to nurture that person through into the next stage of the customer journey. So that's something to consider as well. When you think about the customer journey and where you are using your podcast, for some people, they find that retention is their biggest issue. Getting a client is fine, but then having that retention so that the customer doesn't all of a sudden get attracted by some shiny or bright object that your competitor is offering. So what do you do then? Well, you incorporate a podcast to be able to upsell, but also provide even more value to your existing customer. Because how often do customers, they go away and they say, oh, well, we needed someone who could do X, Y, and Z. Oh, we actually do X, Y, and Z. Oh, do you? I had no idea. And yet, you've kind of had those conversations. So it's a great way to become top of mind, remain top of mind when you are also wanting to upsell or retain customers, because you do that through storytelling. You know exactly where, or you should know as a business, if you're looking at the customer journey, as you're starting to support your clients, where else are the challenges that they're going to be faced with? What opportunities can then maybe open up for them? And are you communicating to that as well to let them know that, hey, we can support you in this as well? Bring case studies from other customers. Again, it needs to be that kind of niche topic. And then you've got this beautiful evergreen resource that you can continue to use. So those are some other things to consider with a podcast too. Because remember, a podcast is a channel, it's a communication channel. And I have to say, Chris, there are no rules other than the rules you set yourself. And guess what? As the host of your podcast and as the CEO of your business, you get to break those rules too.
Right.
We just had this massive pandemic, which has just completely had to shift so many different people's perspective to how they're doing business, their business models. We can change our approach too. So there's always that to have to consider.
Absolutely. And I'm sure there's several people in the audience who are either thinking about starting a podcast, or maybe a few of them have. I mean, I know people have reached out to me like, hey, Chris, it's so inspiring to hear you and your journey, because it gives me hope, because I want to start my podcast and I don't know where to start. And I always tell people, just start. All you need are the headphones that come with your phone, and you can record into your voice memos to get started, and you'll find out your message. But of course it helps, because when I first started the podcast, I wasn't even in real estate. I've been doing my podcast for 3 years now, and real estate for about 2. So it started a little bit differently, and it's kind of gravitated towards, now I talk more about real estate in my day-to-day interactions, because I decided to focus on that and become an expert. But if you have clients, like you mentioned, who already they've been in business for 10 years, they know the problems that their customers have. They know the questions that will come up, and they can have tons of content that they can just create around that. So I think that makes it a little bit easier than if you're just trying to figure it all out from scratch. And you have my trade is a personal branding strategist. So I have to preempt what I'm about to say, because I know that there's some marketers that do say, just get out there and start sharing your message, and it'll hopefully sort itself out. Right.
But I would encourage people, spend a little bit of time in kind of discerning what is kind of that message. Yes, you can evolve, and you can hone it. But with a lot of content that's out there, once it's out there, it is out there. And you can tarnish your brand, if you will, if you're not careful. I mean, and I've done that where I've been speaking about a lot of different things. And I'll share an example. I mean, years ago, I was doing podcasting, and I was using a lot of social media to amplify my message. And I was a personal brand strategist and kind of the business coach, helping people figure out their message. And so what happened was, business owners and networks around in my local region saw me leverage social media, and they said to me, hey, would you come and share with us what you're doing? And I thought, I'm more than happy to. If I can share something that will help someone to get their message out there in a better way, I'm happy to do that. And then before long, I got more interviews or more opportunities to speak. And the lesson was learned when I sat around a boardroom table. I was part of a committee, and one of my colleagues who knew me really well, we were talking before the meeting started. She said, yeah, I've just hired a branding consultant, and can't wait to revisit my message and get clear. And all of a sudden, mid-sentence, she stopped and went, you actually do that, don't you? And I go, yeah. And she goes, I'm so sorry. She said, you've been talking about social media now for some time, and I totally forgot. And I went, wow. And then I realized, you know what? I actually tarnished my brand. I weakened it by saying yes, so I'm so careful now about what I speak about, so yeah, tarnish my own message.
Example.
Yeah. So I had to do some real backpedaling and really kind of say, no, I'm sorry, recommend to people, opportunities to people who were doing that. But something else that also happened too, people would come up to me at the end of a presentation, they would go, love what you said. Can we hire you? I went, oh, I'm sorry, I don't actually do social media. But what a wasted opportunity, but that's what happens. Be mindful what you speak about, because people will often come to you. You don't have anything to offer, but I really didn't want to focus on that. Yeah. Had I been smart, I would have probably created what I call now an umbrella statement to say, look, I'm happy to support you. However, what I really would encourage you to do is let's focus on your message first and then amplify your message. That's what I say. Look, don't start a podcast if you're struggling to stand out from the crowd online. If your message isn't working through the content that you already share, through social media posts, through speaking, networking, and so forth, don't start a podcast, because your podcast is only going to amplify what you're already delivering with your message. So starting a podcast, you're just going to amplify a message that's not going to work.
Right. So that's really good advice. And I mean, I've been going on more other podcasts now, and I like to speak on productivity. And I found this because my most downloaded episode was 5 productivity hacks I recommend. So I was like, oh, that can be my little speaking spiel. And I'll go around and teach people about productivity. And I have a friend now I have hired as a coach to help me bring my idea for this course into life and actually hold me accountable. Chris, did you survey these people? Did you create the first module? And we're getting very specific. So he's encouraging me to just pick a very specific avatar, because I have a generic audience. So he's telling me, hey, what if I target real estate agents as my customers? Because I can speak that language. I'm in it. I'm active. I'm producing income through that. So we're still defining some of that now, but getting very clear, because I told him, he knew that I was all over the place. I'm like, look, do I create something for everyone in my audience or a specific person? And so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But if you could have told me 3 years ago, what we're talking about now, it would have saved me a lot of heartache and trouble probably.
And it's interesting when you talk about, and so true. And, the beautiful thing about all of the challenges and insights that you've learned over the years can really, if you do it strategically, become part of your story. And I call that the invisible thread. And Steve Jobs talks about that. You often are able to join the dots when you look behind and kind of see. But it's the right dots. It's what I call the milestones and the markers. The milestones are the winnings, the things that you've achieved, the successes that you've generated. And the markers are those aha moments, often the learnings through challenges and so forth. But they have to be through the lens of your ideal customer, because they have to relate, they have to resonate, they have to build that rapport. And often I find people are storytelling and they're weaving in all these things, but it's not making an impact, because people are thinking, so what? It's got no relevance to me. But sometimes what you can do is you can niche to a specialty, and therefore you don't niche to a demographic so much, like to real estate. So if you were wanting to really hang your hat on productivity, well, that's a skill that many businesses need, or that's often something that many people struggle with. So you might say, well, I obviously work specifically. I love focusing on real estate agents because I am one myself, and that's what I offer. However, if you're struggling with A, B, and C, this is something that I can support you with too. It's kind of like the podcasting. I mean, mine is really, it's personal branding and positioning and podcasting. I've kind of married those together, particularly for people who want to become that trusted authority. Right. And how do they, build their reach with the right audience, their reputation as that trusted authority, and ultimately their revenue, and making sure that there's that solid, foundations in place. And so once you've got that niche, you can start talking into that. And, many people struggle. It's trying to be that, what's that one thing for me? And I call that your umbrella statement. So there can be different aspects to that, because I'm the first to put up my hand. I love learning, will always learn, love learning new things, love shiny, bright, objects. That's why I loved podcasting back in the day. We do live streaming now with all our podcasts as well, and all these different tools, because I kind of iron out the ways to use it, and then I teach it to my clients. But I needed to come up with that umbrella statement that enabled me to provide context and pull in all of the different areas. So I'm sharing that because you might have a number of different areas that you offer, and it's actually going to be a strength of yours, but you need to, in your own mind, we need to clarify that in our own minds first so that when we communicate it, it comes through with clarity that people think, yes. And so you need to find that umbrella statement. Something that I shared the other day with my LinkedIn community was, when you're thinking about your message and how you're sharing that, if someone can take your current message, remove your name, add their name into that and speak it, and it would resonate with what they're doing because it kind of tells their story, then you haven't honed your message in enough. So you won't be distinguishable or uncopyable or irresistible. So spend a little bit more time and kind of figuring out, and where I say figuring out that invisible thread, where are some of the things that you learned, the transformations, the ahas, the systems kind of, and it can be the most simplest of system that is making the most, impact in what you're doing, and your audience will be wanting that as well. You weave that into your story.
Right.
Like my story is where I started podcasting. I, share that. I accidentally got two 4-figure clients from a podcast that was 3 episodes in from my worst business failure. And I thought, if I can do that intentionally, what would be possible? So a book, a course, podcasts later, this is now what I teach. So that's kind of my story. No one else can share that story. No one else can take my name out of that and put their own name in it because it's not their journey. So you've got to weave in your journey. And once you do that, you're uncopyable.
Yeah, and I do hear several podcasters, and even whenever I bring other guests on the show, they'll have their story that they tell. And I'm sure if I listen to their interviews on other shows, they have the little elevator pitch of what happened in their life. And I have mine too of, I got a degree in school. I got this job that I thought was my dream job. 3.5 years in, I quit. That's kind of part of my story of how I got onto the path that I'm on now. Yeah. And so I always weave that in because others can relate. They're in I'm in this job that I don't like. I thought this was going to be my dream job, and I feel like I've made a terrible mistake. I studied all these years to get into this, and I can't even go to work in the morning. Those kinds of feelings. And like you said, when people can relate, I don't want it to be where they can remove my name because it is my unique story. But in a way, I want them to also be able to feel like they can see themselves in a similar situation, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of company A, they're in company B, and they're still unhappy sitting inside of a cubicle, and they want more out of their life, but they're not sure which direction to go in. And I feel like a lot of us start there, right? We're not really sure. And of course, it's important to at least start. If you can get clarity up front, that's even better. But I guess action beats sitting on the sidelines and waiting for clarity that may never come as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. And, you might even have different, humorous stories from your childhood. And often, it's the things that happen in your childhood that almost kind of preempt where your gifts and your strengths lie. And I remember starting a podcast episode where I was being interviewed, and she said to me, "Have you always been entrepreneurial?" And I shared a story with her, and we just laughed. It was so funny. I said my first business venture was when I was a toddler. And because, business venture, making money, generating income. Anyway, I was rummaging. I don't know how old I was, but old enough to be able to rummage and kind of think, hey. And so as I was rummaging in my father's bedside table, I found an old set of dentures. And I immediately thought, tooth fairy. Teeth, multiple teeth. But you imagine my disappointment in the morning when those dentures were still there. So that was my first business failure, But and kind of the story goes on. My parents, they didn't realise this. They weren't entrepreneurs themselves, but they encouraged or grew in me, I guess, an entrepreneurial spirit, because if I didn't get pocket money, I had to earn, my pocket money and do odd jobs. And so we moved to a farm at the age of when I was 10, and I desperately wanted a horse. And my parents said, well, we'll buy the horse for you, but you've got to buy the feed and you've got to do all of that. So I started what any, horse owner would do, started selling manure. And then my dad said, hey, we could increase that. Maybe if we get chicken manure, we could do a mixed bag. So that was $1.20, and horse manure on its own, $1. So these things. And then I had multiple streams of income by the time I was about 12 or 13, because I was doing babysitting, house cleaning. Actually, the first business venture that we started when we first moved to the farm was we stumbled across this pond in our neighbour's backyard, and there were tadpoles there. So we caught those up, and we stood on the end of the road, of our driveway, and sold them. I think one of our neighbours must have felt really, and so he bought the whole lot, probably went back around and dropped them all back in the pond. But, so some of these stories, it's endearing, and you can just weave them in, but you'll see that I'm always looking for different ways. And I'm sharing this because some of you haven't realised that some of the significant miles and markers in your life can come from childhood. You just haven't recognised it yet. And when you tie it all in together, you can kind of see where that's been leading you. And
that's very cool.
Make for some incredible storytelling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting just to think back to that, because you think a lot of times, what I did as a kid doesn't really impact what I do now, but a lot of it kind of impacts your personality and how you think about certain things. And
massive. Remember, I was a career coach, so I can see things in people, and recognize just a lot of the gifts and the strengths and who they are. And that's what makes you so, anyone so unique. And how often do we hear, Chris, well, I don't really want to start a podcast or start a business in that area. There's so many other people. But there are maybe so many other people, but your ideal client needs to hear your story, because the way that you tell it, the struggles and challenges that you've overcome kind of mirrors their story, and they're waiting for you to get out there and share your message so that they can go, I want you to support me. So, it's those unique aspects. That's often what makes you distinguishable. And I think a lot of people don't spend enough time in identifying what actually makes me unique. What is my style? I call it the distinction triad. There's aptitude. So that's things that you've learned, qualifications, studies, things that you've learned on the ground, by just getting in there and doing. But then there's also attitude, and there's also approach. And that when you get those three things together, woven in with your story and where you really want to make that impact and be the difference, then no one else can copy that. And I came up with a distinction triad when I was working with a client in the career industry. I had helped her about 8 years ago develop her resume, and she came back to me and she said, look, I know that you don't really are not doing that anymore, but she said, I've tried to hire the resume writers, and she said, you really understand me. You were the one that really captured that. And when I told her, look, I'm really not doing resumes anymore, she said, and I felt really sorry for her. She said, because this is what really kind of had me go, okay, I'm going to help you. She said, I finally have recognised and really believe me to be the person that you wrote about, 8 years ago. And I realised then that I didn't write anything that she didn't do, the achievements, the things that she brought to the table. But isn't it interesting that we can be living this experience and being that person, yet we don't recognise it in ourselves.
Right.
She said, I finally own and actually am, believe that I am the person that you wrote about those years ago. And I thought, all right, let's do this. And that's when I realised she was so unique in her business, because she started off as a secretary. And now she was project manager and overseeing multi-million-dollar projects, around the world, the semi-government department. And she didn't recognise them. But what made her so successful was she had the aptitude, but it was also her attitude and her approach to the business that her team just rallied behind her, and she just achieved levels of success that no one else in the team had been able to do. And I recognise you need all of those three things within, when you're thinking about your personal brand and the experience and the story that you bring to the table. And that's when you really can stand out. And guess what? You don't have to put on a mask. You don't have to be anything. You're just yourself. You're just yourself. But often people don't recognise what's that unique brilliance in me that I need to bring forward intentionally.
That's awesome what you said there, because you just keep on doing the work, and you think about who the person you want to be, and you continue working, and eventually you become that person. Because I was seeing myself as a real estate expert before I even did my first deal. And now I've become that person where people are reaching out to me. And there was that period of self-doubt where I was like, oh, how's this person trusting me? I haven't really done enough to understand what I'm doing. And now it's like, okay, I know this. I do this consistently. I'm having conversations with people every single day. And people are also seeing that I'm showing up. And of course, if you're just showing up every day and you're not giving up, that alone speaks volumes, because it's so easy today to just quit after 2 months if something's not working. So if you're still there 2-3 years later, people have a pretty good feeling that you're in it for the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you should say that. In the bio, you mentioned that I've been dubbed the podcasting queen. I remember when someone, it was one of my guests, I can't remember how many years ago, someone said, hey, you're the podcasting queen, because I'd been doing so many podcasts. But I tell you, I was really embarrassed. Podcasting queen, whatever.
Like,
and then when I started, kind of talking to a few colleagues and said, I think I'm really going to now start to hone in, because more and more people are coming to me. I kind of went, I don't want to be, because I really did not want to teach technology, because I knew that a successful podcast was not just on technology.
Right.
And then I embraced that title. And someone once asked me on Instagram, she said, oh, I love the way that you came up with that name. I said, actually, I cannot claim to coin that. That was something that people started to talk, refer to me as, my colleagues. Oh, you need to go talk to Annemarie. She's the queen of podcasting. And so I just embraced that title. And she said, oh, how do I become the queen of anything? And I said, it's interesting. And I kind of reflected on that question. I said exactly what you've just said. Well, you find something that you love doing, and then you realize you're actually quite good at it, and you just do it consistently, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Your audience will often, your community will often start to share things with you, say things about you, hopefully the nice things. You start to recognize, well, hang on a minute, there's something
I am this person.
And observe. Yeah. When I said that to one of my clients who was going through launching her own podcast, she realized that people started to call her as, or refer to her as, the money lady, because she was a spending planner. So guess what she does?
The money lady.
The money lady.
That's cool. So she became it, and she owned the title. I talked to another guest on my show recently, Natalie Cutler-Welsh, and she said, you want people to think of you as a certain thing, and you need to own it as well. Mm-hmm. Because if you're not owning the title for some time, then others may not see you as that person. But once you claim that title, you associate yourself with being that person, a lot more things can happen, because people understand that you are who you say you are, and they start to see you as that person.
That's right.
You're the go-to for that topic or that subject.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I use in my work with clients is a personal branding, a branding archetype. So there's 12 different archetypes, and my primary archetype is the explorer. So always learning new things, always diving in before, and saying yes before I actually know anything. Just love that. But my influencing archetype is the ruler. So the ruler loves systems, love processes, love, kind of building that whole prosperity. So when people started to call me the podcasting queen ruler, I knew it was on brand for me, so that I could step up and kind of own that. So that resonated from a personal branding perspective as well. So that fit, and so hence, ever since kind of been brandishing that title. I must say, it took me a little while to, every time I kind of said it, was like, oh. But anyway, I've been doing it for a while, so.
So you finally are embracing it now.
Yeah, I embraced it. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I know we are ending the hour here, and I want to be respectful of your time, podcasting queen and ruler. Now that we're embracing the titles, that's awesome. And I'll be the expert of real estate in Houston. It really is empowering when you embrace that title and you start to say, I am pretty good at this stuff, and I am an expert. And people, you don't sabotage as much when people come up to you asking for help, because you're able to help them in those things.
Yeah, because it's what you've been doing. You've lived it. You've breathed it.
Exactly.
It's your journey, and that I think is so important, because we all know the imposter syndrome, when there's that doubt.
It's true.
But if you continue to interview people and You're always looking at research material because you know that it's going to add value to what you do for your customers. Yeah, it's just your story, your journey, the story, and the results, they speak for themselves.
Absolutely. Well, Annemarie, you added so much value to my audience today and to myself as well. So thank you, because I'm going to get more specific with the podcast. But where can our listeners go to follow you, to connect with you, to learn more about how you can help them with their branding and podcasting?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is Annemarie.Cross.com. Over on LinkedIn, search for me there. Love to connect with you there. I've got lots of different resources and infographics on some of the podcasting principles, and also personal branding principles, that if you really want to become, distinguishable, uncopyable, and irresistible in your industry, follow me on either of those places, and happy to share more.
Awesome. So Annemarie.Cross.com. I'll put that in the show notes. I'll put the link in the show notes to connect with you. And I know that you are truly what you say you are, because even in the application to apply to be on your show, you were like, what are 3 unique quotes that only you have said? And I was like, I can only think of one.
Yeah.
So I found myself caught off guard on that as well. So everybody, please go connect with Annemarie. And Annemarie, once again, great connecting with you. And thank you so much for your time today.
You are so welcome. Before I go, just let me share one resource, because I want to walk my talk. Remember I said to you, Chris, start off with a 3-part podcast series. Well, I'll let me share the link to mine, AnnemareCross.com/podcast series. So if someone wants to and is struggling to become known as that thought leader, that trusted authority, the 3-part plus a bonus will kind of give you the things that you need to think about so that you can start to position yourself as that trusted authority in your industry.
Very helpful. And I actually had 2 people reach out to me asking me how to start a podcast. So that will be the perfect resource for them to get started. And I appreciate you sharing that with my audience.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity, Chris.
Thank you once again.